we are going to get into the history of West Virginia, specifically through the history of steel manufacturing and coal. But I thought maybe it would make sense to kind of start with some sort of present day issues and or controversies. So there's, of course, a lot of Democratic frustration right now with West Virginia Senator Joe
With who?
Manchin. Yeah, I know. A surprise to you, I'm sure. You've never heard anything about it.
Never heard of anything.
Right. But actually, what I wanted to kind of focus on with, Joe Manchin in particular is less Joe Manchin, or rather, we can talk about him later, and I'm sure we will. But I've been noticing that a lot of the Democratic frustration with Joe Manchin is very often expressed through an animosity toward West Virginia itself, or even West Virginians. I think the most famous example recently was the actress Bette Midler, who tweeted some awful thing like, I hate Joe Manchin. He's so evil. Like, he wants the U.S. to be just as poor and stupid and strung out as West Virginia. And of course, she had to apologize. But it reminded me very much of right after the 2016 election, when you also had a lot of high-profile liberal commentators, really upset about the election of Trump and kind of zeroing in weirdly on West Virginia and being like, I hope they lose their health insurance. I remember seeing quite a few things like that. And it's interesting, right? Because when you think about, we're all frustrated with Joe Manchin, I think, but when we think about the Senate, we also have someone like Kirsten Sinema, who is, similarly a roadblock to some of the dreams and hopes of the Democrats. But I just don't hear the same level of vitriol toward Arizona or people in Arizona as I hear toward West Virginia. So I guess by way of opening up the conversation, Ted, what is it about West Virginia that makes certain people lose their minds?
I think West Virginia's been making people lose their minds for a very long time. Joe Manchin is there's always this rotating villain that's sort of happening too. If it's not Joe Manchin, it's Joe Lieberman. There's this sort of frustration where we feel like, I think you talked about in a previous show that Democrats are trying to lose on purpose. For Joe Manchin in West Virginia, West Virginia just has a long history of class struggle and unionism. With the rise of the United Mine Workers of America. And, in the earliest 20th century, West Virginia was a huge violent struggle for labor rights, a scene for child labor. Some of the biggest strikes in the country, and the most violent strikes happened in this state. And we saw that carry over with the teacher strike. So I think there's always, too, in West Virginia, there's always been this, knowledge that West Virginia wasn't always like this, that it was a rural state. Actually was a lot more diverse than people think it was, especially during the coal boom times where people came together and fought for their rights. It was the only time the National Guards ever, come after union members in a strike during the mine wars. And it was such a New Deal state, from the very beginning. If you go, from the Great Depression up until basically the late 90s, early 2000s, West Virginia was a New Deal stronghold for the country. And I think people are always asking, what's the matter with Kansas? What's the matter with West Virginia? What happened? And I think West Virginia is just a good example of a state that's shifted dramatically. I would say more than any other state, especially over the last 10 years. And that's why I think people are like, well, we know Arizona has always been a conservative for a very long time. We know these other states, but West Virginia, you have very low incomes. It's a very poor state, always has been, but mostly through exploitation. And it is one of those states that, it really was colonized, economically. It wasn't like a woke thing like it is today. It actually was. This is what really happened here. We didn't have much control. Large companies controlled the resources and pillared the land, took all of the timber, the coal and the oil and gas from the state. And I think people almost expect more from West Virginia.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's definitely an element of that. And then again, something that you just touched on is that West Virginia is a very poor state. And I think that, for a lot of liberals, I guess, makes it an easy target. So expand on that a little bit. How did West Virginia get so poor? Because you have gotten into it a little bit, but I just want to, sort of drive home that I just really don't think that West Virginia is poor because, the people of West Virginia have a bad work ethic or a culture of poverty or something. So what's going on in West Virginia? What made it so poor?
I think objectively, it was very true. The class lines before the New Deal it was objectively, poor and exploited. And this culture of poverty actually didn't happen until, The 1960s was actually Michael Harrington's book, The Other America,
Hmm.
and several books that followed too, that started, and the neoconservatives started blaming this culture of poverty for all of the reasons. When we all know that, when you look at the state of West Virginia, especially through a political economic lens, you understand that it's poor because of the outside interests that have dominated the state,
Yeah.
and that has played out. But in that same time that it's been poor and it's struggled throughout all this period, West Virginia has a fighting spirit of fighting for the rights, of fighting for an 8-hour workday against child labor. The UMWA was one of the first unions that was, that came across around racial lines, that was
Hmm.
very diverse in the very beginning. And they used to have a saying, when people came out of the coal mine, everybody was black, and people,
Hmm.
it wasn't a utopia or anything, but people got along to a much greater extent. And for a lot of people, especially black sharecroppers that were coming from Alabama, they came to West Virginia. They could actually make much better wages and be more integrated within the union movement. Uh, and there's some problems with that too later on. But through those New Deal coalitions and right up until the 90s, West Virginia was a very blue state. I mean, look, let's think about it. I mean, West
Yeah.
Virginia voted. We were one of 5 states, I think, that voted for Carter in 1980, and
Hmm.
we were the only Southern state to vote for Michael Dukakis
Hmm.
in 1988, and then we voted for Clinton twice, and the state started shifting. And I think the big reason, as you touched on, was a deindustrialization. West Virginia
Hmm.
has a very sort of low formally educated population. The share of people with college degrees is one of the lowest in the country. It always has been. But we've, to keep a rural place progressive and to keep it like that, you have to have unions.
Yeah.
If you don't have, so much of blue America today is blue because it's highly educated, right?
Hmm.
That's the core. Go find places that are rural, somewhat homogenous maybe, and that are, that are really left wing. Those are mostly union places, union strongholds. And even up until John Kerry's election, all of the coalfield counties, and most of all of them in West Virginia, all voted for John Kerry. The biggest coal producing county in West Virginia, Boone County, voted for Barack Obama. And the shift just kept happening because national Democrats just became out of touch with working class people. And West Virginia is a prime example of that. And the 90s were a great example with NAFTA. It just decimated, the manufacturing industry in the state. We had a huge steel industry. Weirton Steel was our biggest employer in West Virginia. They had over 14,000 workers, and they made more money. The typical worker made more money in the late 70s at Weirton Steel than they would today at Walmart. So just to
Hmm.
give you an idea of that huge shift, and the Democrats became unaligned. And I think, along with so-called free trade agreements and these things, they began to abandon workers and began to embrace more of the neoliberalism of the age.
Hmm.
But the big thing that really happened, I mean, the big fracture in West Virginia politics is climate change, right?
Yeah.
So the late 90s, Kyoto Protocol, was being talked about. And mountaintop removal became a big sort of flashpoint in West Virginia. It became a fission between environmentalists and progressives and the labor movement. And the fact of the matter is, in West Virginia, you can't win without labor.
Yeah.
And people try and try and try, and I think it's great, but it's very, very difficult. They have always been the foundation of the state's progressive politics, and that came to a head in the late 90s because it really
Hmm.
is. It's a Greek tragedy because you look at it, you have climate change, this huge issue we need to deal with. But it is kind of a direct attack on coal because, when I was growing up, I mean, nobody liked the coal industry. We hated them. And the coal
Right.
industry knew that. I mean, there was a poll actually out in 2001 that showed around 40% of people liked the coal industry in West Virginia. And the coal industry was like, we got to change that. And
Hmm.
today, it's over 75% support the coal. I mean, it's a huge shift to go from
Right.
loving the UMWA, being a miner first and caring about the minerals second, to a state that cares more about the industry, because the
Hmm.
unions have also been decimated by people like Don Blankenship that we know
Hmm.
about.
Yeah. I want to pause on this kind of like push and pull that you're talking about between the Democrats and the Republicans, and especially through the kind of interesting history of coal and deindustrialization in West Virginia. Because today, of course, there's no doubt that West Virginia is like Donald Trump country, right? Like
Yeah.
West Virginia, Donald Trump won West Virginia by a landslide, right, in both 2016 and 2020. However, I also want to point out, and people might remember, Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary won every single county in West Virginia. I think that's something like over 50 counties, right?
Yeah, he won every 55 counties in West
Right.
Virginia. And you have to,
55 counties. I can't think of another state where that happened except probably, I mean, obviously in Vermont, Bernie Sanders' home state. So I want to ask you about that. Given what you know about West Virginia, being a West Virginian yourself, studying the history of manufacturing and coal in the state, and of course working where you do, was Bernie Sanders' win in the 2016 primary some kind of weird fluke, or is there a way that Bernie-style politics could succeed and take hold in West Virginia today?
That's a really great question. I mean, first thing I recognized in 2016, I was at a Bernie rally in Huntington, West Virginia, and there were thousands of people there. And the
Yeah.
best thing about it, Jen, is I looked around, I didn't know a person there.
Right.
I was like, whoa. Like if you can bring out people now, because in West Virginia is a small place, everybody, it's like Kevin Bacon, a couple degrees, everybody. So I was like, this is an interesting phenomenon. And we have to recognize too, like, if you go back to the 80s and 90s, 2/3 of voters in West Virginia were Democrats. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now it's like a third. All right. And Republicans have gone up like 5-7%. Yeah. And what we've seen is about 28%, 25% of West Virginians are registered no party, independent. Yep. So for the most part, what you're seeing is people that just want to blow up the system, mm-hmm. And they're like, for 40 years in West Virginia, we voted Democrat, we did this, we voted for Obama, maybe, we voted for John Kerry, we voted for Clinton, and nothing's getting better. Our material lives have not changed a bit. In fact, they're getting worse, no matter who we vote for. And for most people who voted for Trump, like, it wasn't some like, they're not news junkies. They're not watching Fox News every day or CNN or listening to Jacobin, No
right.
But
they will.
They're just, they're just trying to figure out their lives and see how things have changed. I mean, the New Deal and unions really changed it. They were a bastion of political education for people in rural areas. One story I'll tell you too, just really quick, is that I'll never forget a friend of mine who's an author told a story, back in the 80s. She was in McDowell County, West Virginia, which is a southern county, which was one of the biggest coal producing counties in the state, probably the biggest coal producing county in the country, east of Mississippi. Very racially diverse county. She was down there in the 80s at a bar and talking to a coal miner, and this coal miner kept talking to her, like, this guy named Nelson Mandela? Have you ever heard of him? And she was like, wow, this is the 80s, She's like, wow, how did you know about Nelson Mandela? Well, he like lifted from his back pocket a UMWA newsletter and said, well, I've been reading about, what's been going on in South Africa, and I don't like it. I've been reading about it in this newsletter from the UMWA. I mean, just to show you how different the politics were and how people were connected to the outside world through that union education. Mm-hmm. If you go back to the late 70s, I mean, Cecil Roberts, who's the UMWA president right now, they were talking about nationalizing the industry. The energy, and it's wild, right? To think about, like, how far are we away from that?
Yeah. If you like this video from the Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.